Hi, friends. I'm here to talk to you this afternoon uh, about how lawyers intersect with a particular verse of Scripture. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. And you don't often think of lawyers as oftentimes when we think about TV shows like you think of a lawyer as a sneaky saint and nobody listens to him. But I talk a little bit more philosophically about what lawyers are supposed to do and the function they serve in terms of being a peacemaker. When we think about why we have courts, one of the reasons is, let's suppose you and I want to do a business deal, and I'm supposed to supply you with something, and then I don't. You paid me money, and I didn't deliver on my promise. What recourse do you have? Well, without the courts, you find a couple of friends with rude attitudes who come and break my kneecaps. And we as a society feel like we want to see disputes settled more peacefully than that. And so we establish courts and orderly ways to determine the answers to disputes. But we often find that the violence that courts are supposed to substitute for can become forums of great conflict, just like the battlefield. So, when we think about litigation, we also need to think about the damage that it can do to people, to families, to businesses, when litigation is undertaken. And I'm not suggesting that a lawsuit is not appropriate. Sometimes you have to. And sometimes you're going to use that lawsuit as leverage to settle the problem because you show the other side that you're serious and you're willing to move in that direction if you need to. But don't do it just to gin up trouble and heaven forbid, to earn attorney fees. Abraham Lincoln said in July 1850 in a lecture, "Discourage litigation. Persuade your neighbors to compromise whenever you can. Point out to them how the nominal winner is often a real loser in fees, expenses, and waste of time. As a peacemaker, the lawyer has a superior opportunity of being a good man. There will still be business enough. Never stir up litigation. A worse man can scarcely be found than one who does this." So, it's an important thing to think about. Lincoln, of course, himself presided over one of the most contentious and difficult conflicts in history, and probably the most difficult, at least in our history. And I guess the question we have to ask as attorneys and those who hire attorneys is, how do you want to live your life? How do you want to show up in the world? Now, I'm not suggesting, as I said, that there isn't ever reason to file a lawsuit. I've filed a lot of them. And I've settled most of them. And part of my role as an attorney is to get people out of conflict, because conflict is an unhappy place to be. People get ulcers and have heart attacks and all kinds of struggles when they're in conflict. And it could be with a spouse or a soon-to-be ex-spouse. It could be with a business partner. It could be with a competitor in business. It could be with a vendor or a customer. In any case, I'm here to get you out of conflict. Now, ideally, that's through coming up with a solution where everybody wins. Sometimes because of who you have on the other side or because of the nature of the conflict, that's just not going to be possible. But I want to suggest that even if you have to go to war in the courtroom, there is a way to go to war that maintains your inner peace. This book called The Anatomy of Peace, a great book, talks about a bunch of parents at a wilderness rehab program, and that is led by a Jew and a Muslim who've learned to be peaceful with each other and peaceful in their hearts. And they use the example of a great warrior who defended the Holy Land against Christian crusaders. And I'd like to read just a little bit of this story and make a point. After taking Jerusalem in 1099, he continued, the Crusaders took control of most of the coastal areas of the Middle East. They continued to hold these regions for about 80 years. They succeeded largely because of infighting between rival Muslim military and political leaders. This began to change, however, with the rise to power of the Turkish Sultan Nur al-Din, who unified the various peoples of Syria. The tide turned entirely in favor of the Muslim resistance under his successor Yusuf Saladin, or simply Saladin, as he is known in the West. Saladin united all the Muslim peoples from Syria to Egypt and mobilized their collective resistance. His armies recaptured Jerusalem in 1187. Militarily, politically, and in every other way, Saladin was the most successful leader of the period. His successors were so surprising and total that historians sometimes invoke luck and good fortune to explain them. However, as I have studied Saladin, I am convinced that he succeeded in war for a much deeper reason, a reason that won't seem at first to be related to war at all. What, Pettis asked, what reason? To understand it, Yusuf answered, we need to get a better feel for the man. Let me tell you a story. On one occasion, an army scout came to Saladin with a sobbing woman from the enemy camp. She had requested hysterically that the scout take her to Saladin. She threw herself before Saladin and said, yesterday some Muslim thieves entered my tent and stole my little girl. I cried all through the night, believing I would never see her again, but our commanders told me that you, the king of the Muslims, are merciful. She begged for his help. Yusuf paused for a moment. If you were to research Saladin, you would discover that this story is characteristic. He was renowned for his kindness towards allies and enemies alike. I'm not sure those who died at the end of his army's swords thought him kind, Elizabeth interjected. But I agree that in comparison to the others of the period, he did shine a little brighter. Lou was unimpressed. This is Lou Herbert, who was a CEO. His mind drifted back to Vietnam and to all the dead young men in his regiment had to carry out of the jungles. When he had returned from Vietnam, Lou made a personal point of visiting the mother of each soldier. There were 50 some odd soldiers whose parents Lou visited. He loved his men. To this day he dreamed of ways he could have saved more of them. Being kind and merciful is well and good, he thought, but they are traits that are poorly rewarded in wartime. With that bit of background, Yusuf continued, let me contrast Saladin's recapture of Jerusalem with the Crusaders' initial invasion. In the spring of 1187, after the Crusaders had broken a truce, Saladin called upon the forces of Islam to gather to Damascus. He planned to march against the occupiers in a united effort and drive them back from their lands. If I might, Elizabeth stepped in once more. Who was occupying whom was not entirely clear, as I mentioned before. Each side viewed the other side as an occupying force. Right, Yusuf said. Sorry for the imprecision. Resuming, he said Saladin sprung a trap on the occupying Western forces near the Sea of Galilee. A few escaped, including a leader named Balian of Ibelin. Balian escaped to Tyre, where, via messenger, he made a surprising request of Saladin. He asked whether he could go to Jerusalem and fetch his wife and bring her back to safety in Tyre. He promised he would not take up arms in defense of Jerusalem. Saladin agreed. However, upon arriving in Jerusalem and finding there was no one to lead its defense, Balian begged Saladin to let him out of his commitment. He wanted to stay and lead the resistance against Saladin's army. Saladin not only allowed it, he sent an escort to lead Balian's wife from Jerusalem to the safety of Tyre. Lou let out an audible harumph. Yes, Lou, kind of hard to imagine, isn't it? She must have been a looker, that's all I can say, Lou said, looking around for a laugh. Miguel obliged him, his eyes dancing with mirth and his broad shoulders rolled with laughter, but, for the rest, the joke fell flat. Skipping ahead. The siege of Jerusalem began on the 20th of September, Yusuf continued. 9 days later, Saladin's men breached the wall close to the place where the Crusaders had flowed through almost 90 years earlier. Saladin put his men under strict command not to harm a single Christian person or plunder any of their possessions. He reinforced the guards of Christian places of worship and announced that the defeated peoples would welcome to Jerusalem on the pilgrimage whenever they liked. As a way to restock the treasury, Saladin worked out a ransom structure with Balian for each of the city's inhabitants. And it goes on to say that Saladin forgave the ransom for many of the people who could not afford it. Yusuf looked around at the group. He sounds disturbingly weak to me, Lou said. Yes, Yusuf said, so weak that he was the most successful military leader of his era and remains revered to this day. He's still weak, Lou insisted, and soft. Why do you say that, Lou? Elizabeth interjected. Well, Lou began, you must have heard what Yusuf said. He let all those people take advantage of him. You mean because he spared their lives and let them make off with the treasury? They weren't in it for the treasury, she answered. They were trying to establish a lasting victory. Then why not get rid of their enemies, Lou objected. Let them walk away and just allow them to fight another day. Trust me, I fought in Vietnam. We would have been massacred there if that's what we'd done. Pettis spoke up. We were massacred in Vietnam, Lou. They continue talking about Vietnam. And when they get back to talking about Saladin, Yusuf asks, do you notice any differences in the two victories? Certainly, Pettis responded. The Crusaders acted like barbarians, and Saladin, he was almost humane. For someone who was attacking anyway, he added. Say more about what you mean by humane, Avi invited. Pettis gathered his thoughts. He finally said Saladin seems to have regard for the people he was defeating, whereas the crusading forces seem, well, to have been barbaric, as I said before. They just massacred all those people and thought it didn't matter. Exactly, Avi agreed. To the initial crusading forces, the people didn't matter to them. That is, the crusaders didn't really regard them as people, so much as objects or chattel to be driven or exterminated at their will and pleasure. They continue talking about this for several more pages. But it comes down to this statement. The issue of the way of being is of great practical importance, Avi continued. First of all, think of a difficult business situation, say a complicated negotiation, for example. Who do you think would be more likely to put together a deal in difficult circumstances? A negotiator who sees the other in the negotiation as objects, or one who sees them as people? This question piqued Lou's interest as he was in the middle of union negotiation that was going nowhere. The one who sees others as people, Pettis responded. Definitely. Now, if you think about it, is your lawyer going to do better playing hardball, sticking it to the other side? It might make you feel better if you're in a bad place inside yourself. It might, for a moment, give you a sense of justice or revenge or whatever you want to call it. But how lasting is a victory, particularly if it's someone you've got to still deal with? Whether it's your kid's other parent or someone else in your industry. If you stick it to them, how's that going to work out down the line when you have to deal with this person? Sometimes we have to go to battle like Saladin did. Sometimes we've got to go in, fight hard, and win a victory. Sometimes as a lawyer, I've had to go to court to protect my client's interest because there was no option settling it. But what if the other side calls me up or sends me an email and says they want another couple of days to respond to my brief? Okay? I grant those professional courtesies whenever I can, whenever it will not prejudice or harm my client. Because, see, I want to be like Saladin, and when I need that in my client's interest, I want to be working with people who will grant those courtesies to me. I just prefer to live my life in a way that I'm peaceful toward other people, even my adversaries. We may not see eye to eye, we may not agree on something, we may not be able to settle the case. We'll try. But what gives you the best chance of coming to a resolution that works for you? The idea of seeing the other side as human beings with real stories to tell, with a real thought, with opinions and ideas that are valuable just like your client is, just like you are. Or the let's stick it to him mentality, I want to see him hurt. I guarantee you, if you treat them in a way that is anything less than as human beings and children of God, your chances of settling are going to be a lot less. Your expenses are going to be a lot higher than they would need to be. And the outcome is likely to be less satisfactory. I regard myself as an attorney, as a peacemaker. Now, sometimes I have to make peace by going to war. Sometimes I have to get my client out of conflict by standing up for them against a bully. I've done it more than once in my career. But an agreement is more likely to hold together and be successful if both sides have entered it with some degree of voluntariness and they feel like they've bought into it, even if it's not all they wanted. So, when you think about hiring an attorney, think about hiring someone who's skillful more than hostile. Someone who's intelligent, not someone who's mean. Someone who sees other people as human beings and is willing to deal with them on those terms. And I hope this has been helpful to you. I hope it's given you something to think about. I think sometimes that all of the alternative dispute resolution that we are engaging in now, whether it's mediation or arbitration or go down the list of, a list of things that we try to do to solve disputes, maybe that whole industry arose because lawyers are failing to put their clients' interests ahead of their own, and failing to be peacemakers, making war when we could make peace. And again, I love the injunction, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. And I don't think the attempt to make peace and encourage cooperation is weakness. I think it's strength. Being able to go to battle when you have to and do it in a civilized way is also strength. But in either case, the ultimate goal is to restore peace, to let people sleep at night, to give them a sense of certainty in their lives. And I hope you'll think about that. All right. We'll talk again soon.